Since someone had already mentioned it, how about let's pull on some more of the, of course, always overlooked, unnoticed, practical aspects and impacts of polarized thinking on everyday life. And in particular, someone had just mentioned, as I said, a quote that went something like this. It was, anything that is critically spoken of cannot be changed, and anything described as broke, and don't write me and say broken, anything can be described as broke can't be fixed. I'm sure you'll be relieved to know, as always, at least you think that you're having some sort of minor neurological tremor. This, of course, is insane. It is nutso, it is impossible. Fill in the blanks. Write them on the back of a milk carton. But consider, this is behind a whole truckload of common wisdom, religious platitudes. If you can see it, the obvious one that cannot be adequately explained, as nothing can in a polarized world. But I guess the most basic one, probably the grandfather of them all, is the good thing about don't judge your neighbor, don't judge your fellow man. Of course, there are others. Don't knock the rock. That's from the 50s. Not the 50s BC. So there's a wide range, I'll grant you that, from the Old Testament idea of don't judge thy neighbor to don't knock the rock, but I think you'll find that to be fairly inclusive. But what this has to do with is the energetic reality behind it is very, shall we say, subtle. Because there is no religious ultimate behind this. There is no moralistic paradigm behind it. You get into, at the very least, a kind of six-dimensional funny physics wherein your initial neural processes regarding something as being in some way incomplete or flawed, once that happens, and it's not psychological, it's not even verbal, but once the neural process has taken the reflection of something, and it will always, of course, be in the secondary sense, of something as being in any way broken, damaged, less than finished, questionable. Once it initially does that, by nobody's particular observation, by the source, that is the particular nervous system, particular brain that we may be discussing as an example now, just fictitious, from that one source, that one brain that has initially looked upon something or someone as in some way less than totally acceptable from their view, then it cannot be, from their view, fixed. What happens at the very best, it can be partially rehabilitated. But it cannot be put into some completed, to them, totally acceptable, my compliments to the chef form. About the best you can say is, with this kind of rehabilitation, is you can, remember we're dealing with a polarized situation, and about the best you can do, remembering now I was pointing out that from another view you cannot fix something once it has been described as broken, nor can you change something once it has been critically noted. The best you can do is be compared to real change, a real completion of sorts, would be a kind of rehabilitation along such lines as you might make chocolate begin to sort of taste like vanilla, kind of. Now, rather than, of course, if you were just walking in here off the street and trying to analyze this. Rather than taking that as being some sort of attack on humanity, of course it's not, but you should see it in a practical view of what you've been faced with all of your life and all kinds of unsatisfactory explanations as to why it is that once you have said something like, God, I hate my little sister, and your family beats you on the head with bladder bags and they tickle you, they threaten not to buy you anything, they do everything. Or you say, I hate school, or I hate spinach and rutabagas. And then people say, quite grown people, one man reputed to be the president of our country has expressed a run-in from his childhood, and psychologists will point out something like, isn't that, again, a prime example of the power of the subconscious, that someone can say, I hate broccoli, and here it is 60 years later, and the man is reputed to be the president of this country, and he says, I am now the president, and I still don't like broccoli, and now that I'm a big guy, I don't have to eat it. And psychologists can say, isn't that something? It shows the power of some subconscious drive. You know, his family, his mother, somebody probably beat him on his little head and said, come on, George Herbert, eat your broccoli. Come on, come on. No, I won't, no, I won't. You know, who knows what? You know how psychological attempted explanations are. Not that that won't fly, but it doesn't explain anything. But now consider what I am trying to get you to see, albeit insane, unreasonable, illogical, non-sequential, etc. That it doesn't matter. It has no bearing, or it is not borne upon by one's family, by peer pressure, by any particular incident involving broccoli, or your little sister, or asking the girl next door does she want to play doctor. When are they going to get up to date, though, and little kids get together and say, let's play doctor, and the little girl says, all right, and he says, all right, I'll be the neurosurgeon. And the girl thinks, boy, what a bummer. At any rate, it is on the basis of energy, and it is on the basis of it being more universal than it having any local derivative source that makes someone later in life, 2 minutes later, 20 years later, make a statement about, well, I still don't like so-and-so. I didn't like elementary school. I don't know, I had several teachers, and I didn't like it then. And you're talking to a man 55 years old with a PhD now. He's back at a reunion somewhere, and something comes up about school, and here it is, 50 years after the fact, and him saying, you know, that is strange. I don't know at the time. I know now I am in the world of academia, and I enjoy good intellectual challenge as well as the next man, but in my earlier years, I did not like school. I can still remember my family used to have to drag me to school at the beginning of every year, all the way up to the 7th or 8th grade. And that all sounds all right. Like, well, who knows what happened? What happened is, once something has been run through the process of any particular nervous system here, and it is spoken of critically, or it is described as being broken, it cannot be, in some way from that same view, it cannot be totally repaired. Now, people attempt to, obviously, or you should see, to, I'm calling it rehabilitate it. That is, people will say, well, that's silly the way I used to say I hate my sister. I mean, now that you bring that up, I can remember it. I was just a little kid. You know, I don't feel that way now. I know it's probably had something to do with sibling rivalry. Probably I had a subconscious belief that my family enjoyed her company more than mine. And all that sounds fine. Again, it explains nothing. But notice that people will still, educated, sophisticated, everyday people, will still make reference to, will still admit to long ago feelings and expressions of feelings, even while saying that they have been rehabilitated. That is, well, of course I don't hate my sister. That was just a kid talking. But notice, here it is 50 years later in the conversation, just talking to somebody, it will still come up. You don't have to bring it up and say, aren't you the man who used to say you hated your sister when you were a kid? You can just be sitting around talking to somebody, almost a stranger. Sitting around at a bar, sitting around at a convention somewhere of smart, educated, sophisticated people convention. And just sit around and be talking to somebody and, you know, what do you do for a living? Blah, blah, blah. And finally, you got brothers and sisters, blah, blah, blah. Did you all grow up in the same, you know, was a good nuclear family? Were you all together? Blah, blah, blah. You know, you get along with your sister, blah, blah, blah. A stranger, and you've been talking 2 or 3 minutes, and you get him going, and just an ordinary person, man with education, will finally come up with something like, well, yeah, I really like my sister. Well, she lives now in Portland. I only see her maybe once or twice a year, but it's really fun being with her. Of course, it is strange. When I was a kid, I don't know why I remember this, but I used to just throw fits about how I hated her. She was a year younger than me, about a year and a half, really. And I don't know, just like suddenly somebody came in the house and I was no longer king of the mountain. I guess it's that kind of Freudian blah, blah, blah. And here it is, somebody you've just met. All I want you to hear is, not because that person that I'm making up is in some way himself or herself flawed or unusual. It is simply the kind of, unnoticed from the view that I'm trying to get you to grab hold of tonight, it is a continuation of the fact that once something is spoken of critically, once something is described as broken, from that same view, it can never be totally repaired, perfected, or fixed. And thus, you have people not being able to speak plainly about such matters. So you have a sister. How old is she? Well, she's 1.5 years younger than me. And you don't ask anything else, and he says, or maybe you have to have a little bit. Do you see her much? Do you have a lot in common? Well, she never did finish school. She finally got married, but she's very intellectual. I like being around her. What little I see her now, but I just thought of something. And there it goes. People do that, and it's not because of some institutional or psychological impact of psychology. People have always done it because the nervous system is still being driven by the same kinds of needs of life as it was being driven when the little kid or the grown man when he was a little kid. It has not changed that much. He weighs more. His vocabulary is probably a little greater than it was when he was 12. There is an inescapable aspect, and it is hidden. It's the unnoted background to all of these sorts of things that come out in older times religiously, and that now comes out, just a variation that comes out psychologically. But all this stuff about, as ye judge, so shall you be judged. And people, the nervous system all over the world, and you would not have to attribute that to any particular religion. You can just say that in a particular, the right language, the native language, all over this planet, almost at any time since men have been speaking. And the heart, the middle of the bell curve of civilization, of humanity at that time, wherever you say, as you judge, so shall you be judged. And the nervous systems go, whew, like the little dogs in the back window. They do. Because it's not religious, it's not psychological. And yet if you ask somebody, why do you immediately acquiesce to that? Even if they weren't religious, I guess they'd say, what in the hell does acquiesce? Well, no. They'd say, well, wait a minute. It has something to do that, I don't know how a humanist would, I guess they would. They'd come up with some psychological, if they were quick thinking as you and I, they'd come up with some kind of phony baloney about, well, it has to do with the psychological reflections of you projecting your own shortcomings and that's their own people, and then, oh, I don't know. Waiter? But of course, in older times, it was easy because you simply said, hey, the reason that I went, yeah, that's true, is because God said that. Allah said that. The great forces said, don't be judging your fellow man. The God said, hey, we made man. It's none of your business what goes on. Don't go around picking on other people, because the same way that you go around judging your fellow man and saying, oh, shame on you, you just wait till you get up here and we got time to deal with you. Somebody's going to remember that. They're going to write down a book and you're going to show up and we're going to go, oh, and they're going to punch each other, the gods, and say, there's a guy went, oh, shame on you, and they're going to look at you suddenly, and now you are trembling, just shortly after being dead and wondering what the hell's going to happen next. That's bad enough. And the guys are going to go, ooh, shame on you. So that, in other words, just desserts. If not Boston cream pie, at least karma with whipped cream. That you're going to get it. But that still doesn't explain anything. You're always thrown back to, God said so. It says it right here in the Bible. I'm telling you what it is, in a more subversive sense, is that if you see broke, you be broke. And it's not psychological. It's not religious. But once, and you can't help it to start with, but once you let the tiger into your living room, once you let him in, you can't ever say, well, I didn't mean to invite you in. I mean, you can say it, but it no longer has any validity. Then all you're dealing with is that kind of running battle of trying not that this is not worthwhile, but then you're dealing with, all right, I'm not going to listen to it. Because the tiger, once he's in the house one time, you can't ever say, no, I'm not going to deal with this. Because once you let him in, he's always in. Again, it's not religious, not moralistic, and it's certainly not psychological. Put it to you another way, if, which is impossible to start with, but if you wanted something or someone to seem more finished and more functional, you shouldn't break them in the first place. Of course, I said that for the reason that some of you responded. Because it's too late at the ordinary building site level neurologically, but you can still learn from it. I'll assume that those of you that guffed and hawed in a certain way, that it did strike you. What I'm talking about, it was just another way of putting it. But if it had been possible, and of course now that you've heard it, it can be possible that you're suddenly confronted with something new, a new idea or a new person. If you want them to seem, and I'll put seem in 2 or 3 tiers of quotation marks if that helps. If you want them to seem more finished, more functional, more complete, is don't break them in the first place. And then you don't have to go back and try to rehabilitate them, much less try to actually fix them. Because once you meet somebody, and you go, hello, how are you? And they turn around to leave, and you turn to somebody and say, get a load of him. Where'd they find this guy? You know, who does she think she is? And then later, you find yourself attracted to the woman, or later, if it was somebody of the same sex, somebody you badmouth, and then you try to say, well, wait a minute, I could use his help. You said the man was an attorney or a doctor? Wait a minute, maybe I'll talk to him. In a sense, you have then already broken them. Once you've criticized, it can't actually be changed. Not at the old level. Or once you describe them as being broken, you cannot really repair them. So the thing is, if you would like them to seem more finished, more functional, complete, is don't break them in the first place. You could also look, if we want to go back and play religious a minute, all these good old stories that we have drawn out metaphorically and symbolically on several occasions, throughout the history and throughout the world, including the Old Testament for those of you who are Old Testament aficionados. All this great thing about nothing was really going into the gods, or a god said, blotto or whatever, that, was first the Word, which of course is a fair description, if you understand in a certain way, of the growth, the expansion from man's primary existence into the secondary world, because the secondary world did start with a word. Of course, 2 words, as we've been through in the polarized sense, but these stories for the children, that is the rest of humanity, of saying, and then God looked around at all this stuff and went, it doesn't ever say what word, but at least in the Old Testament. Some other religions have words. But anyway, he finally says a word, and it, boom, everything takes off. It's like he first did it, and it was like a freeze frame, and he says, the word. And then the movie starts to run. Creation starts to be viable, alive. If this is still as non-sequential as your grandmother's knickers, but real plain speak, real plain thought, non-polarized thought would be that which would have to happen, not post-Godward. I know I could simplify that. All right, it's impossible, but take it symbolically that the secondary world, that is you and everyone else, all of humanity, being intellectually alive, that the nervous system grew to this point to where you were a thinking creature. If you were going to, in some way, it's impossible now from any ordinary view, but if you were going to be in some way beyond, not confined to polarized thought, you would have to be talking in a way that was not a product of the God's first word. In other words, if all you can say is whatever anybody else can say after the first word, after that it's all polarized. Well, you got to admit I made it simpler. It may not make any more sense, but it's simpler. You would have to be able to talk before anybody else could talk. You would have to be able to talk before you talked. And of course you cannot do that at the ordinary level. But that is what would be entailed vis-a-vis people now trying to rehabilitate talk, because once it's polarized, it cannot be unpolarized. That is, once you can talk at the ordinary level, you're going to judge and be critical. And of course then life knows how to run this dynamo, and part of what it says is, hey, don't be critical. And everybody goes, that's true, that's true. But you cannot talk after he once said, well, all right, here's the difference. Here's night and here's day. You know, here's chocolate and here's vanilla. And Adam and Eve and the original Buddhas and everybody else went, wow. And then they could think. Then the AC, the polarized current, got here, and it's, I guess as your forefathers were wont to say, men became conscious. But once they could do that, it was all polarized. But part of the message is, don't think in polarized ways. Don't judge your neighbor. Don't be critical. You should not for the first time ever be critical, not for the first time ever let the tiger in. You should not for the first time admit that you are driven by polarized thought. Never do it for the first time. And then if you get real good at that, I could refer you back to a Kai root from a long time ago that says, don't ever do anything for the first time. And I can still recall that got a good hearty chuckle. And now you know why. Because if, as impossible as it is, if you could not have ever done anything for the first time, then think where you'd be now. And don't say Flagstaff. Of course, if you hadn't, you wouldn't be anywhere. But if things could have been just slightly different, that wouldn't be true. But of course, if things were slightly different, you would have such places, such desirable destinations as Flagstaff having a much better trailway station. But you've got to deal with life as it is. How about another little piece from what we were talking about the last time or two to do with polarized thought? And if you recall, we were mentioning how it is that behind all criticism, all sarcasm, all humor, which is always of a secondary nature, you do not laugh at sex itself. You can only laugh at jokes that has taken sex into the secondary realm. You do not laugh at somebody starving. You can only laugh at a joke about somebody going in and trying to order some dish while they're the first time they're in the Bay Area and they're trying to impress somebody and order whatever would be the latest in nouveau California cuisine, and they mispronounce broccoli. It's written in French. Or they look down the menu and they inadvertently order, the owner's brother-in-law. Then it becomes funny, but there's nothing funny about primary affairs, which justice takes over even before we talk about it, because if in some way you could, again, arbitrarily divide up and slice up man, and he was still operating at the primary level while yet talking and thinking, which it can't be done, but if he could, he would never even think to make a joke about any of the primary activities. Being hungry, and I don't mean other people starving, but not excluding that, but there's nothing funny about being hungry. You can't make a joke out of being horny. Trust me. You can't make a joke out of dying. You can't make a joke out of being cold, being too hot. It's only once it becomes secondary that you can make a joke about it. Because then there has got to be this contrast. There has got to be the polarization. That was just to try and bring us up to some sort of speed. But more connected to what we're talking about tonight, I wanted you to consider that this way, that anytime you laugh at or criticize some other human's secondary behavior, which it's got to be secondary behavior, their secondary behavior, their interest, their ideas, you're doing so, I'm assuming that you understand something now, you'd be doing so on the basis of a complete disregard for the fact that whatever it is that you're laughing at or criticizing is at best a very imprecise, a very shaky secondary reflection of some more stable, basic, necessary, primary motivation. That's the only way that you can laugh at it. That's the only way you can criticize it. That's the only way that you can fear it. That's the only way you can be aghasted by it, if there was such a word. But it has to be that you're in complete disregard of, assuming that you at one time saw it, of the fact that whatever they're doing, whatever it is they're saying, whatever it is that they are expressing as an idea, a theory, a belief, it is simply a polarized, very imperfected reflection, the same as yours would be, of some more stable, more non-funny primary motivation. And when I say non-funny, it's beyond criticism. Because if any of you caught what I was saying, that if we could, and we can do it verbally, arbitrarily divide up and say that man could still live a primary existence while yet having the kind of secondary facilities to think, to talk, and to hear me point out something, not only would he find nothing funny, there'd be no jokes, there'd also be no criticism. You cannot criticize at the primary level somebody going out to get food. Now, they may come over and try to get your food, and you may end up fighting and killing them, or them killing you, but there is no form of criticism. There's nothing to say. Thus you have another view, I was going to say, of the reality behind all the great moralistic, religious, truism, proverbs about talking about your neighbor, attacking your neighbor, thinking ill of your neighbor, and etc. It is that if life was unpolarized, if it was at the primary level, there would be no such. That the only ill will of a real revolutionist would be murder. It'd be confined to that. Some of you, very few I'll admit, laughed at that one a few nights back. But for a revolutionist, ill will should be confined to just actual acts of murder. Now, you can take that non-literally if you'd like to, of course. Thank you. But if you saw from a certain view, there is no... It's not something you can wrestle with and try and theorize, but there is simply no fashion statement to be made by having ill will, unless you're just going to head and kill the person. Now, we're talking about something a little more, symbolically, of course, acceptable. But anything this side of that, I hate to tell you. I don't care if you're 6'4", 300 pounds. I don't care if you are wearing the garb of a religious person. It doesn't matter what you are. Anything this side of murder is a whine. And you can be William F. Buckley. You could be Gore Vidal. You could be a religious, social, psychological commentator. You could be a would-be city revolutionist speaking out against the king, the powers that be. But if it's in the ill will, you may have a great band of people in line with you, and you say, we are being mistreated by this group or that man over here, or our leader. Let us say many people join in with you and say that our ill will is justified. Still a whine. I mean, if you kill him, it doesn't matter at the city level, but if they kill him, then I'll grant you, all right, they quit whining. Thank God, and just did it. But now a little more symbolically. all forms of criticism, all forms of just irritation at the dumbness of people. It is very unbecoming. Because if you understood it a little more specifically, symbolically, you would, I suggest, give me a more hearty laugh to say that ill will to a revolutionist should be confined to acts of murder. If they annoy you, kill them. I mean, if that's what it's going to take. But other than that, shut the hell up. There's only one good card, and it's not Hallmark, to send to someone who actually deserves your ill will. That's a bullet. I mean, I say a bullet. I know that's not the only method, but that is, the cleanest compared to using a butcher knife or a pitchfork. But don't send people hate mail symbolically. And don't look at people and go, oh, Jesus. Boy, I wish I could get them people and slap them around. Or what's going on with the world? Either shoot them or forget it. That is truly a symbolic shot at polarized thinking. When you laugh, when you criticize the secondary behavior of others, which is all you can do, when you do that, even the laugh you're having, you're ultimately laughing at the wrong place. There's another form of whining that we have never tried to describe, but it's a kind of humor that's actually a whine. It's a kind of humor that in the past we've described as ordinary humor and is always tied to, inseparable from, some form of hostility. That you cannot, at the ordinary, secondary, verbal level, take any joke you ever heard and take out the hostility. You can do it yourself. You don't need me to act as your surgeon. You don't even have to put it to sleep. You just extract the humor when it's not, the hostility, and by God, the humor is gone. Another way to look at the hostility, instead of using that word, is you are laughing at the wrong place because it is a necessary secondary reflection of something that life needs. And for you to laugh at it, for you to criticize it, is for you to see broke and for you to be broke. It keeps your thinking polarized because there's no right and wrong at that level. It is not that the good guys are going to win. That is, you and I. And think about these poor, deluded, blister brains over here. If they would finally straighten up, life could become more like a utopia. So we can keep Moore and those other writers out of there. But the good guys can't win. The bad guys can't win. As long as it's polarized thought, there is no satisfactory conclusion. That is one thing I'll throw at you before we change. I would also point out that as part of the electrical fun of humor at that level is a good joke. A good laugh on your part almost gives the feel of something resembling a period to a sentence. To really laugh at somebody, for them to make a joke about some profession or some religion or somebody, and you go, ha, ha! It's almost as though we wrap them up. And you haven't. At the ordinary level, that's the way it's supposed to be done. But you have not, because you are, in a sense, locking yourself even more firmly, as if you needed to, into polarized thought. And that, as we attempt to ride off to the adjoining ranch, that is the reality. That is the energy reality behind all the old things about don't pick on your sister, don't knock the rock, don't badmouth someone else's religion, just don't pick on your neighbor. Just don't do it. The gods don't want us to. It's not right. It's psychologically harmful. And everybody in the middle of the bell curve in life goes, yeah. Now you know why. And now I rest assured you'll be a much better person for it. assuming you don't all convert and become Southern Baptists. Then don't blame it on me. A certain sidestep regarding polarized thought, regarding what would be polarized thought being the necessity in a polarized world. How about that vis-a-vis another possibility that we might call revolutionist thinking, plain thinking, plain speaking, as opposed to polarized, even plain feeling. The impossible gap between polarized thought, polarized feeling, polarized speech, which is never plain, never direct, even when it seems to be, it's not. That as opposed to whatever the hell we may be meaning by right now, plain speak, plain thought, plain feel. The gap is such that under everyday conditions, they're never noted. Under everyday conditions wherein the circumstances being described would seem to call for, if not accept, but even seem to call for some obvious, straightforward expression of feelings, ordinary people seem incapable of doing it. Give you examples. I had them here somewhere. A man, we can do it amongst people, or we can do it now, what seems to be greater reality, a reporter on TV and a person. That seems like even greater reality than to say, hey, two guys were standing under a tree talking. Now, that was a pretty good example maybe 50 years ago, but if you said now, there's a guy standing out under his tree that has just been hit by lightning, and a reporter come up and says, boy, how do you feel? I mean, that sounds like a more important, so here it is. The trial just got through, and a reporter rushes up to the husband, and the man who has just been convicted of murdering his wife in some dastardly way has just been sentenced to be electrocuted after a terrible trial, and all sorts of horrendous evidence and testimony, and a reporter goes up and asks him, now that it's over and the man's been convicted and sentenced to die, how do you feel? And a man, just an ordinary, civilized man, nowadays will say, of course I'm glad the trial's over, but to tell you the truth, I have mixed feelings. It's not right or wrong. There's no problem yet, but just notice from another view. Would that not, for one instance, or just so you don't take it negatively, a reporter rushes up to this guy, he just got back and says, how does it feel you're the first man to nude climb Mount Monstrous and come back? How does it feel? And he'll say, well, my feelings are somewhat ambiguous. Of course, I'm glad to be back and alive, but then again, I'm sort of, sad that it's over. And everybody goes, yeah. But now think for a second. That gives you a wide range. And that's just, it's every day. If I hadn't pointed this out, you would never laugh at this. It's just every day you accept that. But now think from a certain view that has nothing to do with criticism, has nothing to do with humor or sarcasm. Would it not, just from another small view, just for a second, the man, that they say, how does it feel that now the evidence was overwhelming that this is the man who, in fact, he admitted it, murdered your wife and your children, but murdered your wife, and now they've finally convicted him, he's sentenced to die. How do you feel? Would it not be somewhere between call for, or at least expected, a guy go, I'm going to tell you the truth, I am so happy to think about that bastard frying. I hope they have some sort of, I keep reading about that they have more and more trouble of breakdowns in electric chairs. I hope they have to run it through. I hope it drags out for 30 or 40 minutes. Now, you know that is not the norm. And it's got nothing to do with civilization, got nothing to do with education. It's got to do with something else. It's got to do with the polarization of the human nervous system, not only thinking, but the expression of what people call their feeling. Would it not be? Or would you find it anything strange, even a civilized man, that you knew some of the circumstance of the case, and they say, they've convicted him, and they're going to sentence him to die. What do you think of that? How do you feel? And the guy say, I am delighted. This is the best I've felt since my wife died, since that bastard killed her. I wish I could throw the switch. I wish I could do something even worse to him. That is not the norm. It is not the norm for them to say, well, how does it feel that you have now, after years and years of trying, either climb Mount Monstrous or you have now run the world's fastest mile, 42 seconds. Well, he told me to say it. He's given to exaggeration. If you ask somebody, how does it feel? Or a man who's several times run for president or governor, and they say, well, here it is, finally, and they're having a celebration there at 2 in the morning, and his opponent's conceded. How does it feel now that you have finally become governor or senator? And people say, well, God, of course, I'm glad the contest is over. I'm glad the race is over. But there's a certain kind of, bittersweetness to it. A certain kind of ambiguity seems to be in my soul. Why don't the man just say, I am so happy. God almighty, I'm so happy I could spit in a bucket. Now, you could say that there is nothing socially, there is nothing certainly legally to keep, even my first example, as distasteful as it might sound in certain quarters, for this husband to say, this is the happiest day I've had. This is the only day I felt at all happy since my wife died, since she was murdered. It's to know that bastard's going to fry. I hope he is tortured. There's nothing illegal about that. But that is not, and it's not right or wrong, but that is beyond the general flow of the human nervous system expressing itself, even in feelings, not just thought and behavior, but in its feelings itself. It's still operating through a polarized process, and it's like nobody ever thinks about it, or what you want to call it. Why is it that somebody says, God, I'm glad I hope he dies a horrible death. I hate that son of a bitch's guts. I can't, are we showing camera? God, I hate him. Now you can say, well, that is not civilized. That's what the law's for. I can explain it as well as you can. I can take up for it. I can give some rationale for it. But just notice, it is not the norm all the way from lesser educated, less sophisticated, to more sophisticated. Of course, the spectrum does begin to weigh the further we get to the latter, because that's part of being sophisticated and educated, to be more and more a native, a cosmopolitan native of the secondary world, wherein, did anybody notice tonight, some of you, I heard one or two heavy breathes. I didn't hear any laughter, but I point out that the civilized, in a secondary sense, Kairos did, do not really fear opposing philosophies, even the most barbarous. In any city, the majority in some religious party, some political party, the civilized in any area, they do not really fear the philosophy of some opposing army, some opposing group. What strikes fear in the secondary soul is those still amongst us that are less secondarily native, who will murder and have no philosophy. That's the fear. And it's not just political, and it's not just a matter of you and your kin being subject to mayhem. Not that that might not be important. But it's not simply that literally. But notice it is literally that when it gets reflected, because what is frightening? What is the most frightening? The news doesn't even want to cover it. They never have. Thousands of years ago, Homer and people didn't want to write about it. Even murderers. In warfare, it's always a matter of that there's some touch of the heroic in the person. Or nowadays, if it can't be heroic, then this guy that killed a bunch of people, you talk to him, and a psychologist says, well, I have spoken to him in private, and it turns out that his uncle used to beat him about the head with a wooden spoon and accused him of being a Lakers fan and mistreated him and all sorts of things. There has to be, but if they try and interview somebody, if a story comes out and here's a man who has committed mayhem against the state, against society, and he shows, I say no philosophy, but I'll go ahead and be crude, he seems to show no remorse. I mean, he doesn't even defend himself. He didn't say anything like, well, I had a bad childhood. He just doesn't show any particular concern. That is the more hardwired reflection of what I was saying, is at the secondary level, what is civilization, what is civility, is being more and more a native of the secondary world as opposed to the primary, that you are simply more civilized. And the fears, although it comes out another way, the fears between groups of people, although they may, on paper, in theory, which is, of course, all secondary, have grievous differences between their religious beliefs, their political beliefs, their economic systems, and they may say this is going to drive us to war, or after the fact they may say it drove us to war. Sorry, didn't drive them to war. Secondary does not do it, it's the primary. And at times it's maybe more complex than we have time to go in for, a combination having to do with the difference in any particular group between their primary, the balance between their primary and secondary, and then that difference compared to some other group's difference between their primary and secondary. But at any rate, it is not the philosophy of somebody else. It's not their religion, which is all a matter of philosophy. It's all secondary affairs. It's not that frightens one group. It's not the philosophy of another one, no matter how foreign, exotic, barbarous, egregious. It's not that. It's some murderous act being done by another group or person who seems to have no philosophy. Why did you kill these people? Well, I'm a Muslim and you're a Jew. Ah, you may not like it, but if somebody says that, or you're a have and I'm a have-not, you got money and I don't. Oh, well, I don't like it, but to find out that they seem to have no philosophy, that's the bad rap that they tried to put on Attila. And it turns out that there's more and more literature written about the man than was commonly available earlier. And it turns out that he was not such a good villain after all. Because a good villain has got to be somebody that they say, why did you do so and so? Why did you sack Rome? And he looks like Rome. What was... We're talking about the guy that just got through, just killed off and burnt. And they go, why in the world did you do that? Why did you destroy this great city of Rome? And he goes, Rome. Like, he looks around, did we go to Rome? Get away, I ain't got time for that. That's the fright, not the murder itself, not just the conflicting attitude of one group to another, or one person to another. It is a secondary person. It is the secondary world being confronted with a primary inasmuch as it still exists and rears its naughty head, its nonverbal head. It is that conflict, it is that potential that frightens the knickers off the secondary world. Back to where were we? That is tied to the inability, to put it crudely since we're running short, of people to be able to think, speak directly, and to speak particularly directly and plainly about feelings. Because the only feelings that could be spoken directly about would be primary, and once you can speak about them, they're no longer primary. And then those who do not speak about them are closer to operating at the primary level, is why the murderer with no philosophy, that is no excuse, no comment at all to make, is so frightening. But of course, you don't have to look out there. But of course, if he's about to go up on you, you might want to look out there. But you can look in here. What is it? What drives the belief in psychology? What drove your forefathers' belief in demonic possessions and that the human spirit or soul, and of course they're talking about this, being a battleground between good and evil. They're talking about the primary and the secondary. The struggle. And what frightens people? Not noises in the night. They can say it does. The same way the Protestants can say, well, the Catholics frighten me. They can say all that they want to. What is frightening is internally that there is a state, there is a polarized version of you that is murderous and has no philosophy. The term that you hear continually nowadays is mixed feelings. I was using that when they ask somebody, how do you feel? All the way from, and it's just everywhere. You should know that. It's in you, but they ask, the man how he feels about his wife's murderer being sentenced to death. They ask somebody, how do you feel that you have won this particular political race? How do you feel that you have taken set a new world's record in this event in the Olympics? Or to ask someone, how does it feel that you have won $22 million in the lottery? You do not hear some plain expression of feeling. The most common nowadays, the most common will have something to do with the ambiguities, I feel. I mean, I see people that obviously have got, well, better than some of us, but probably a primary school education, and yet everybody now that has a TV, I think, knows the word ambiguity. They say my feelings are somewhat ambiguous. I have mixed feelings. I was going to use that instead of ambiguous. That's the most common term, I guess, is mixed feelings. And you might be sitting there at home. They're sitting there in their own home up here, the reporter. It's like that. Like that is profound, even coming from some little dunderhead that just won a contest, or somebody that just, for no particular reason, that's worth any great prolonged notice, but they get on TV there for a few seconds. Well, how do you feel about this? How did you feel? Weren't you the first one that saw the building burning and people jumping out and screams and people leaping to their death? Aren't you the first one that saw it and phoned it in? Yes, I am. God, how did it feel to look up and see all that? Well, of course, I guess I had mixed feelings. What are they saying? What are humans saying? What is the brain saying when it says it's having mixed feelings? Now, it will have its own if the reporter says, well, how so, sir? And you say, well, of course, the mixed feelings were, I saw this great fire in the people, and I was almost frozen in my, what can I do? My astonishment. And my fear that it could have been me or my family could be in there. And then my feelings that I've got to do something, but I almost couldn't leave. It was like, you do not nowadays say, how did you feel when you saw that? Geez, I thought, God damn, that's the biggest fire I've ever seen in my life. Or I was so scared that I wet my pants. They say mixed feelings, not just those crude jokes I made. But it continually, and not just people on TV being interviewed for the news, you. Well, how do you feel now about your sister after all these years? Well, of course, I love her. It's nothing like when we were kids, because kids, I guess we had our kind of struggles like all siblings. But nowadays, she really means a lot to me. But you said you only see her about once a year. Well, yeah. But, well, I mean, I like her, but, when you ask, how do you feel about your sister or your brother? I guess you got to say, if you're going to be really truthful about it, it's kind of like you got mixed feelings. I mean, there are things I remember from childhood when I thought she got preferential treatment. And there are times that I really, I guess, hated her, and I even feel guilty about when I see her now, and she didn't even know it, perhaps. So, you like your own parents, like your own mother. You love her, but then again, you kind of, hate her. Everybody from the Pope, your rabbi, everybody except perhaps your mother, nowadays will go, yeah. How true. But what are they saying actually? What's the human nervous system saying behind that when it says mixed feelings? What mixed feelings actually equates to, from the kind of view that I was trying to get you to peek through, the kind of view whole, is mixed feelings is actually referring to the mingling, the essential, necessary mingling of secondary and primary needs in the nervous system. Finally, that it is not to the most efficient transformation and transfer of energy, not that one little instance would make any difference, because as a matter of fact, I'm sure that, without any doubt, that somebody somewhere has been interviewed whose family member was killed and the murderer was convicted, and they said, how do you feel about that, about him being convicted and sentenced? He's the first person going to be put in a new electric chair. And you know damn well that here and there there's been people being interviewed somewhere that went, I love it. That sorry son of a bitch. And then it probably gets so bad that they don't even show it. But it happens. But notice, that is the anomalies. That is not the norm. So what life needs is not that. Or that would be the norm. what life needs in those instances and in every little day instance of your relationship. Somebody's saying, honey, do you still love me? You don't say it much anymore. And you go, oh, yeah, sure, I love you. And then to yourself, you might think, that's strange. If you're given to a philosophical bent, you might go, or if I jumped into your brain, some troll, and said, do you actually love him or her anymore like you used to? And you go, well, yeah, but come on, be truthful, level with me. Well, it's like, it's nothing to hurt. It's like mixed feelings. Maybe you've been around somebody so long, or I don't know what it is. I certainly, I like her, but do you love her the way you said that you used to? Well, I can't say I don't. Well, can you say anything directly? Well, yeah, I got kind of mixed feelings. I mean, hell, I'm human. You could quite easily, surely by now, see that it would not be an untoward notation to say that ordinary life seems to be arranged in such a way regarding people's feelings that men cannot usually speak and think in any way that could be classified as being just plain and direct. And this, of course, has nothing to do with also the little anomaly somewhere of some smartass here and there that does seem to speak direct. There's kind of people that say, well, what we should do is all express our feelings. And my mom called me the other day and said, why don't you come see me for Mother's Day? And I said, well, because mostly I hate your guts. We're talking back to the norm, not that sort of thing, which is not part of the norm. But notice that it is with the norm of humanity that things would appear to be arranged, just face it, in such a way that people cannot usually, they don't even think about it, they don't even note it. They cannot speak in some plain, simple, direct way. And it's not noticed. Contrary, if it was pointed out, ordinary humanity, I'm sure you can see this, they would take the kind of position I just covered in the last 60 seconds about, well, wait a minute, what do you want from people? Because oftentimes you hate somebody's guts, but you don't want to tell them that. I mean, what purpose will it serve? Plus, you might want to do business with them sometime. So you don't say that. You just kind of, change the subject or do something. That's still not it. See, they do not notice that, forget the circumstance. That's the attempt to explain things in an episodic way that, well, under these conditions. But it's not under these conditions. It is not local. It is universal in the wiring of man that things are arranged so that people do not speak. They do not think simply and directly. And there's a reason. It's known as polarized thinking. It's known as the electrical energy that drives the human brain. And at any ordinary level, you cannot. And if you did, at the ordinary level, you would be no more than one of these neurogenital wart anomalies I just mentioned. If somebody, you would say, well, what do you think of other religions other than yours? They all suck. They're all nuts. Whereas, that is not the norm. That is not what life needs. Nowadays, what it needs is, well, I think that, I just know all religions somewhere are basically, they have a basic common denominator and they're all reflections of some great universal truth. And like, well, yeah. And so at the ordinary level, as always, it's not that men could do otherwise. But I was going to, of course, here at the end, suggest to you that if you were going to do something out of the ordinary, you have got to be able to in some way bypass that. Not literally, of course, and not that you start talking that way. But if you continue to be driven by polarized thought, there's no way out. The tape is over, 0. Well, since the tape stopped, I guess I'll stop.